At 30,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, Captain Sarah Phoenix Martinez thought her days of life-or-death decisions were behind her. She had traded her F-22 Raptor cockpit for the captain's seat of a Boeing 777, believing commercial aviation would offer the peaceful skies she craved after 15 years of military service. But, when catastrophic engine failure struck Flight 847 with 164 souls aboard, the legendary fighter pilot call sign Phoenix would rise from civilian obscurity to remind the world why some heroes never truly retire. The two F-35 Lightning II fighters that scrambled to escort the crippled airliner had no idea they were about to witness aviation history. Their pilots, young hotshots fresh from training, were ordered to monitor what seemed like a routine emergency landing. But, when they heard that unmistakable voice crackling through the radio, calm, precise, fearless, transmitting the call sign that had become legend in military circles, they realized they weren't just witnessing an emergency. They were watching a master at work. This is the extraordinary true story of how a decorated combat pilot's past collided with her present in the most dramatic way possible, turning a potential disaster into one of the most remarkable saves in aviation history. It's a story of split-second decisions, unshakable courage, and the moment when 164 lives hung in the balance at 6 miles above the Earth. Captain Sarah Martinez adjusted her headset as Trans-Pacific Airways Flight 847 climbed steadily through 28,000 feet into the crystal-clear morning sky above the Pacific. The Boeing 777's twin engines hummed with their familiar, reassuring rhythm as she scanned the instrument panel with the practiced eye of someone who had been reading gauges and displays for over 2 decades. But these weren't the sleek, military-grade instruments of an F-22 Raptor that she had spent 15 years mastering. These were the calm, predictable readouts of commercial aviation, a world she had chosen after hanging up her flight suit and retiring her legendary call sign Phoenix. Beside her, First Officer Michael Chen was reviewing their flight plan to Tokyo. At 28, Chen was sharp, ambitious, and reminded Sarah of herself when she first started flying. He had been working with Sarah for 6 months now, and, while he knew she was former military, he had no idea about the reputation that preceded her in fighter pilot circles. To him, she was simply Captain Martinez, professional, unflappable, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to read weather patterns and aircraft behavior. "Weather looks perfect all the way to Narita," Chen reported, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who still found wonder in flight. "We've got a slight tailwind that should put us ahead of schedule." Sarah nodded, her dark eyes scanning the horizon where the Pacific stretched endlessly blue beneath scattered white clouds. After years of flying combat missions over hostile territory, where every cloud could hide an enemy aircraft and every radar blip could mean life or death, this peaceful stretch of ocean felt like a meditation. The 164 passengers behind them were settling in for the 11-hour flight, businesspeople heading to meetings, families visiting relatives, tourists beginning their Japanese adventures. None of them knew that their captain had once been shot down over enemy territory and had spent 3 days evading capture before mounting one of the most daring rescue operations in Air Force history. The transformation from combat pilot to commercial aviator hadn't been easy. Sarah had enlisted in the Air Force straight out of high school, driven by a childhood spent watching aircraft at her grandfather's crop dusting business in Nebraska. She had excelled in flight training, earning her wings and quickly distinguishing herself as one of the most naturally gifted pilots her instructors had ever seen. But it was her performance under pressure that had truly set her apart. During her second deployment to Afghanistan, Sarah's call sign Phoenix was born from an incident that would become Air Force legend. Her flight of 4 F-22s had been providing close air support for ground troops when they encountered a much larger enemy force. In the chaos of the engagement, Sarah's aircraft took critical damage from surface-to-air missiles. Most pilots would have ejected, but Sarah had noticed wounded soldiers pinned down below with no other air support available. Against direct orders to abandon the mission, she had pushed her damaged fighter beyond its limits, using every trick of physics and aerodynamics she knew to keep the aircraft airborne long enough to neutralize the enemy positions. When her aircraft finally went down, she had saved 37 ground troops who would have otherwise been overrun. The fact that she had managed to glide the heavily damaged fighter to a controlled crash landing, then evaded enemy forces for 3 days before coordinating her own rescue, had elevated her to legendary status among military aviators. But that was another life. Here, at the controls of Flight 847, Sarah had found the peace she had been seeking. commercial flying had its own satisfactions: the precision of navigation, the responsibility for passenger safety, the routine that allowed her mind to rest after years of hypervigilance. She had been flying for Trans-Pacific Airways for 3 years now, building a reputation as one of their most reliable captains. Her safety record was spotless, her passenger ratings consistently excellent, and her ability to handle weather-related challenges had earned the respect of her peers. The morning had started like any other. Sarah had arrived at Los Angeles International Airport at 4:30 a.m. for the pre-flight briefing. The weather report showed clear skies and favorable winds. The aircraft, a Boeing 777-300ER with the tail number N847TP, had completed its maintenance checks without any issues. The passenger manifest showed 158 passengers and 6 crew members for a total of 164 souls on board. Everything was routine, predictable, safe. As they reached their cruising altitude of 30,000 feet, Sarah engaged the autopilot and settled back in her seat. The Pacific spread out below them like a vast blue carpet, empty and peaceful. Chen was reviewing their fuel calculations and updating their estimated time of arrival. The cabin crew had begun their service, and the first gentle chimes of passenger call buttons were beginning to sound as people settled in for the long flight. "You know," Chen said, looking out at the endless ocean, "I still can't believe this is my job. Flying over the Pacific at sunrise, getting paid to see views like this." Sarah smiled, remembering when flying had felt that magical to her. Before it had become about life and death, about split-second decisions and enemy missiles and the weight of other people's lives in her hands. "It never gets old," she replied, though she was thinking about a different kind of flying altogether. The intercom crackled to life as the lead flight attendant, Jennifer Walsh, updated them on the cabin situation. Jennifer had been flying for Trans-Pacific for 12 years and had worked with Sarah on dozens of flights. She knew the captain as someone who was always prepared, always calm, and possessed of an unusual ability to sense when something wasn't quite right with the aircraft. "Everything's smooth back here, Captain," Jennifer reported. "We've got a full load today, couple of honeymooners heading to Japan, a business group from Microsoft, and about 30 members of a church group from Dallas taking a mission trip. Everyone's settling in nicely." As Sarah acknowledged the report, she found herself thinking about the responsibility she carried. In her F-22, she had been responsible for her own life and the success of her mission. Here, she carried the lives of 164 people who had trusted her with their safety. It was a different kind of pressure, but pressure nonetheless. The difference was that in commercial aviation, everything was designed to be predictable. Systems had backups, procedures were standardized, and emergencies were rare. At 8:47 a.m. Pacific Time, Flight 847 was exactly where it was supposed to be, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. They were 2 hours into an 11-hour flight, with fuel consumption tracking perfectly to plan and all systems operating normally. The aircraft's twin Rolls-Royce Trent 800 engines were purring along at their optimal cruise setting, pushing the 777 through the thin air at 516 miles per hour. Sarah was reviewing their route when Chen pointed to something on the engine monitoring display. "Hey, look at this," he said, his voice carrying a note of curiosity rather than concern. "Number 2 engine is showing slightly higher than normal exhaust gas temperature." Sarah leaned over to examine the reading. In commercial aviation, such small deviations were usually nothing to worry about. Engines ran hot and cold depending on atmospheric conditions, fuel quality, and a dozen other factors. The temperature was elevated but still well within normal operating parameters. "Keep an eye on it," she told Chen. "Probably just atmospheric conditions." But even as she said it, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in her 3 years of commercial flying, that subtle tension in her gut that had kept her alive through countless combat missions. It was the feeling that had warned her about enemy aircraft before they appeared on radar, that had told her when a seemingly routine patrol was about to turn deadly. Her military instructors had called it situational awareness, but Sarah had always thought of it as simply paying attention to what the aircraft was trying to tell her. The engine temperature continued to climb slowly, almost imperceptibly. Chen was monitoring it closely now, but he wasn't worried. Sarah, however, was beginning to feel the familiar weight of responsibility settling over her. She began running through emergency procedures in her mind, not because she expected to need them, but because preparation had become as natural to her as breathing. At 8:52 a.m., the engine temperature passed into the yellow zone on the monitoring display. Still not dangerous, but definitely outside normal parameters. Chen reached for the engine manual, beginning to read through the troubleshooting procedures. Sarah was already 3 steps ahead, her mind cataloging their options: nearest airports, fuel calculations, passenger safety procedures. "Let's pull back the power on number 2 just a bit," Sarah instructed. "See if that brings the temperature down." Chen made the adjustment, reducing power to the right engine by a small margin. The aircraft's flight management computer automatically compensated by increasing power to the left engine to maintain their speed and altitude. For a few minutes, it seemed like the simple adjustment might solve the problem. The temperature stabilized, though it remained elevated. But Sarah's instincts were screaming now. Something was wrong with that engine, something more serious than a simple temperature fluctuation. She had seen engines fail before, had lost one engine in her F-22 during a training exercise and had to nurse the aircraft back to base on reduced power. The signs were subtle at first, easy to dismiss as minor variations. But they were there. "I want you to start looking at our diversion options," she told Chen quietly. "Just in case." Chen looked surprised. The engine temperature was elevated but stable, and they were still well within safe operating parameters. But he had learned to trust Captain Martinez's instincts. "Anchorage is probably our best bet," he said after consulting their charts. "We're about 4 hours out." Sarah nodded, but she was thinking about more than just diversion airports. She was thinking about 164 people who had no idea that their routine flight to Tokyo was about to become anything but routine. She was thinking about the weight of command, the responsibility of decision-making under pressure, and the skills she had hoped never to need again. At exactly 8:58 a.m. Pacific Time, as Flight 847 cruised peacefully at 30,000 feet above the seemingly endless Pacific Ocean, the number 2 engine's exhaust gas temperature spiked into the red zone. Alarms began to sound in the cockpit, and Sarah Martinez felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once made her the Air Force's most decorated female fighter pilot. The Phoenix was about to rise again. The alarm that pierced the cockpit of Flight 847 at 8:58 a.m. was unlike anything First Officer Chen had ever heard during his 5 years of commercial flying. It was insistent, urgent, demanding immediate attention. But what struck him most was the complete absence of panic in Captain Martinez's response. While his own heart rate spiked and his hands moved instinctively toward the emergency checklists, Sarah's demeanor remained as calm as if someone had simply pointed out a minor navigation error. "Engine fire warning, number 2, she announced matter-of-factly, her voice so steady it might have been describing the weather. Her hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced precision, years of combat flying distilled into muscle memory that didn't distinguish between an F-22 and a Boeing 777. "Michael, I need you to run the engine fire checklist while I handle the aircraft." The Boeing 777 shuddered as the number 2 engine began to tear itself apart internally. What had started as an elevated temperature reading was now a catastrophic failure involving bearing seizure, turbine blade separation, and the beginning of an uncontained engine fire. The aircraft's sophisticated monitoring systems were flooding the cockpit with warnings: fire detection, engine parameter exceedances, hydraulic pressure loss. Sarah's left hand was already on the thrust levers, reducing power to the failing engine while her right hand maintained control of the aircraft. The asymmetrical thrust situation was causing the 777 to yaw to the right, requiring constant pressure on the rudder pedals to maintain straight flight. But, where most pilots would be struggling with the sudden workload, Sarah seemed to expand to meet the challenge, her awareness encompassing every aspect of the aircraft's behavior. "Fire handle pulled," Chen announced, following the emergency checklist with methodical precision despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. The fire suppression system discharged its agent into the engine compartment, and the fire warning light extinguished. But the engine was still windmilling uselessly, and the damage was already done. "Good," Sarah acknowledged. "Now I need you to calculate our single-engine performance and get me our options for emergency landing sites. We're going to Anchorage." As Chen worked through the complex calculations required for single-engine flight planning, Sarah was simultaneously managing multiple crises. The loss of the engine had knocked out one of the aircraft's 3 hydraulic systems, making the controls heavier and less responsive. The electrical system was redistributing loads automatically, but she was monitoring the process to ensure no critical systems were affected. Most challenging of all, she was calculating in her head the physics of flying a 450,000-pound aircraft on one engine while carrying enough fuel for an 11-hour flight. The math was unforgiving. The Boeing 777 was designed to fly safely on one engine, but their current weight and the distance to suitable airports created a narrow envelope of acceptable performance. Too fast, and they would burn fuel at an unsustainable rate. Too slow, and they risked losing control of the aircraft. The margin for error was razor thin. Captain Chen's voice carried a note of concern as he completed his calculations. At our current weight, we're going to be right at the edge of single-engine performance capability. And Anchorage is still 3 hours and 45 minutes away. Sarah had already reached the same conclusion through her own mental calculations, but she also understood something that wasn't in any manual. She had once flown a heavily damaged F-22 for over an hour on partial power, using every trick of aerodynamics and energy management she had ever learned. The principles were the same, even if the aircraft was vastly different. We're going to dump fuel, she announced, her decision cutting through the complexity like a blade. We need to get down to single-engine maximum landing weight as quickly as possible. Fuel dumping was a procedure rarely used in commercial aviation, typically reserved for the most serious emergencies. It involved releasing thousands of gallons of jet fuel into the atmosphere, fuel that represented hours of flight time and significant cost. But Sarah understood that their survival depended on reducing weight to improve their single-engine performance. As Chen coordinated with air traffic control to establish a fuel dumping area clear of other aircraft, Sarah was making another critical decision. Their altitude of 30,000 feet was actually working against them. The thin air at cruise altitude meant the remaining engine was producing less thrust, and the aircraft's aerodynamic efficiency was reduced. They needed to descend to a more optimal altitude for single-engine flight. We're going down to 15,000 feet, she announced, beginning a carefully controlled descent. The engine will produce more thrust in the thicker air, and we'll have better glide performance if anything else goes wrong. The descent had to be managed carefully. Too steep, and they would build up speed that would be difficult to control with asymmetric thrust. Too shallow, and they would waste precious time and fuel. Sarah flew the descent manually, feeling through the controls how the aircraft was responding to the changed conditions. In the passenger cabin, the signs of crisis were becoming apparent. The initial engine failure had produced vibrations and unusual sounds that had awakened sleeping passengers and drawn concerned looks from those awake. The fuel dumping created visible streams of mist from the wing, and the cabin crew was beginning to field questions from increasingly worried travelers. Jennifer Walsh, the lead flight attendant, made her way to the cockpit to get an update. She had been through emergency training dozens of times, but this was her first real crisis. When she knocked on the cockpit door, she was prepared for the scene of controlled chaos she had observed in training simulators. Instead, she found Captain Martinez flying the aircraft with one hand while calmly reviewing approach charts with the other. First Officer Chen was busy with radio communications and performance calculations, but the atmosphere in the cockpit was more like a busy air traffic control center than a crisis situation. Jennifer, Sarah said without looking up from her charts, I need you to prepare the cabin for an emergency landing in Anchorage. We've lost one engine, but we're in complete control of the aircraft. Estimated time to landing is 3 hours. I want the cabin crew to review emergency procedures, but there's no immediate danger to the passengers. Jennifer had flown with Captain Martinez enough times to know that if she said the situation was under control, it was. But she also knew that losing an engine over the Pacific Ocean was about as serious as commercial aviation emergencies could get. What should I tell the passengers? Jennifer asked. Sarah paused her chart review for the first time since the emergency began. Tell them we've experienced a mechanical problem that requires us to land in Anchorage as a precaution. Tell them their captain is a former military pilot with extensive emergency training, and that everything is proceeding according to standard procedures. As Jennifer left to brief her crew and prepare the passengers, Sarah continued her methodical preparation for what would be one of the most challenging approaches of her career. Anchorage's Ted Stevens International Airport had long runways designed to handle heavy aircraft, but landing a fuel-heavy Boeing 777 on one engine in potentially challenging weather conditions would require every bit of skill she possessed. "Michael," she said to Chen, "I want you to set up the approach for runway 7L at Anchorage. It's the longest runway, and the winds should be favorable. We're going to need every foot of that runway." Chen was working through the approach setup when a new voice crackled through their radio. "Anchorage approach control, already aware of their emergency and clearing airspace for their arrival." But what caught Sarah's attention wasn't the controller's instructions. It was the background chatter she could hear from military frequencies bleeding through the radio transmission. "Scrambling 2 F-35s to provide escort." Sarah's mind flashed back to her military days, when fighter escorts were dispatched to provide assistance and observation during aviation emergencies. The F-35 Lightning II was the newest generation of fighter aircraft, flown by pilots who would have grown up hearing stories about legendary aviators like Phoenix. But there was no time for nostalgia. The aircraft was approaching their fuel dumping completion point, and Sarah needed to recalculate their performance for the approach to Anchorage. The wind conditions were favorable, but she was concerned about the aircraft's handling characteristics with an asymmetric thrust situation and reduced hydraulic power. "Fuel dumping complete," Chen announced. "We're down to maximum landing weight plus about 10,000 pounds. It wasn't perfect, but it was manageable. Sarah ran through the approach parameters in her mind. They would need to fly the approach at a higher than normal speed to maintain control authority with the asymmetric thrust. The touchdown would be firm, and they would need maximum reverse thrust from the remaining engine to stop the aircraft within the runway's confines. But, as Sarah prepared for the most challenging landing of her commercial career, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: the absolute clarity of mind that came with life-or-death decision-making. Every sound from the aircraft, every instrument reading, every slight change in the controls was feeding into a mental model of extraordinary precision. At 10:15 a.m. Pacific Time, as Flight 847 continued its careful descent toward Anchorage with fuel streaming from its wings and one engine silent, 2 F-35 Lightning II fighters launched from Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson to provide escort. The young pilots manning those fighters had no idea they were about to meet a legend. Sarah Martinez was no longer just a commercial airline captain dealing with an emergency. She was Phoenix again, and she was going to save 164 lives. Lieutenant Colonel Jake Viper Thompson pushed his F-35 Lightning II through the Alaska sky at 400 knots, his wingman Captain Lisa Razor Park maintaining perfect formation off his right wing. They had received the scramble order 20 minutes ago: emergency escort for a disabled commercial airliner inbound to Anchorage. It was the kind of mission that typically involved flying alongside an aircraft with minor problems, providing visual confirmation of external damage and ensuring clear airspace for an emergency landing. As they climbed through 25,000 feet toward their intercept altitude, Thompson was reviewing the brief information they had received. Trans-Pacific Airways Flight 847, Boeing 777, uncontained engine failure, 164 souls on board, captain requesting emergency landing at Anchorage. Routine enough, except for one detail that had caught his attention during the briefing. "Control, this is Viper 1, Thompson radio to Anchorage approach. Can you confirm the call sign being used by the emergency aircraft?" Viper 1, Flight 847 is identifying as Trans-Pacific 847, but the captain has also been using military call sign Phoenix for coordination with military assets. Thompson's hand almost slipped off the throttle. Every fighter pilot in the Air Force knew the legend of Phoenix. The stories had become part of squadron folklore: the female F-22 pilot who had saved 37 ground troops with a damaged aircraft, who had evaded capture for 3 days behind enemy lines, who had pulled off rescues and combat maneuvers that defied both physics and common sense. But Phoenix had retired years ago, disappearing from the military community as suddenly as she had emerged from it. "Razor, did you copy that?" Thompson asked his wingman. "Phoenix?" Captain Park's voice carried the same mixture of disbelief and excitement that Thompson felt. "As in the Phoenix? I thought that was just a legend." "We're about to find out," Thompson replied as they reached their intercept altitude and began scanning the sky ahead for their target. Meanwhile, in the cockpit of Flight 847, Sarah Martinez was deep in the methodical preparation that had kept her alive through 15 years of military flying. The aircraft was now at 15,000 feet, its single remaining engine providing just enough thrust to maintain level flight while they continued toward Anchorage. Every system on the aircraft was functioning within acceptable parameters, but the margin for error was virtually non-existent. "We've got company," Chen announced, pointing through the windscreen where two gray shapes were approaching from the north. "Military escorts." Sarah glanced up from her approach charts to watch the F-35 sliding into formation alongside her aircraft. The fighters were flying with the kind of precision that spoke of highly skilled pilots, maintaining perfect position relative to the much slower and larger Boeing 777. She keyed her radio to the military frequency that Anchorage Control had provided. "Military escorts, this is Trans-Pacific 847. Thanks for the company." Thompson's reply came immediately, but there was something in his voice, a formality that suggested he was testing something. "Trans-Pacific 847, this is Viper 1 providing escort services. Please confirm your captain's call sign for our records." Sarah paused, understanding what was being asked. Her military call sign was part of a past she had tried to leave behind, but, in this moment, with 164 lives depending on her skills, she realized that past was exactly what she needed to embrace. "Viper 1, this is Phoenix," she replied, and, even through the radio static, Thompson could hear the quiet confidence that had made her legendary. The effect on the two F-35 pilots was immediate. They were no longer providing routine escort for a disabled airliner. They were flying alongside one of the most decorated combat pilots in Air Force history, watching her handle an emergency that would challenge any aviator. "Phoenix, this is Viper 1, Thompson's voice carried new respect. "We have you visual. Your aircraft appears to be trailing a light vapor stream from the right wing area, consistent with fuel dumping procedures. External damage to the number 2 engine appears minimal." Sarah acknowledged the report while simultaneously running through her mental checklist for the approach to Anchorage. They were still 2 hours out, but she was already visualizing every aspect of the landing. The runway was 12,400 feet long, plenty of distance for a normal landing, but challenging for a heavy aircraft on one engine. The weather was currently clear with light winds, but Alaska weather could change rapidly. "Chen," she said to her first officer, "I want you to coordinate with the cabin crew. We're going to brief the passengers on emergency landing procedures in about 30 minutes. No reason to worry them sooner than necessary, but I want everyone prepared." Chen nodded and began reviewing the passenger briefing procedures while Sarah continued her approach planning. But her mental processes were operating on multiple levels simultaneously: part commercial airline captain following established procedures, part combat pilot calculating angles and physics and survival probabilities. The F-35 escorts were providing more than just a military presence. They were acting as her eyes, able to observe aspects of her aircraft's condition that she couldn't see from the cockpit. More importantly, their pilots understood the gravity of the situation in a way that civilian controllers might not fully grasp. "Phoenix, Viper 1, Thompson's voice carried a note of professional concern. We're showing some intermittent smoke from your number 2 engine area. Not continuous, but visible periodically." Sarah's jaw tightened slightly. Intermittent smoke suggested that the fire suppression system had controlled the initial fire, but there might be ongoing hotspots or oil burning off from the failed engine. It wasn't an immediate threat, but it was another variable to monitor in an already complex situation. "Copy that, Viper 1. We're monitoring all engine parameters. Fire suppression system activated successfully, but we'll keep an eye on it." What Sarah didn't tell the F-35 pilots was that she was already calculating what would happen if the engine fire reignited during their approach. At low altitude with a heavy aircraft, they would have virtually no options except to land immediately, regardless of runway conditions or wind direction. It was the kind of scenario that kept airline pilots awake at night, but Sarah found herself approaching it with the same analytical calm she had once brought to combat missions over hostile territory. As Flight 847 continued its careful progress toward Anchorage, the situation in the passenger cabin was becoming increasingly tense. Despite the crew's efforts to maintain normalcy, the sight of military escort fighters and the obvious change in the aircraft's sound and handling characteristics had made it clear that this was no routine flight. Jennifer Walsh was moving through the cabin, speaking quietly with passengers and answering questions as best she could. The church group from Dallas had organized themselves into a prayer circle. The business travelers were mostly absorbed in their electronic devices, but she could see the tension in their faces. The honeymooning couple near the front of the cabin were holding hands tightly, staring out the window at the F-35 flying alongside them. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," Sarah's voice came over the intercom with the same steady professionalism she had maintained throughout the crisis. "As you're aware, we've experienced a mechanical problem with one of our engines that requires us to land in Anchorage, Alaska, as a precaution. We are currently flying safely on our remaining engine, which is performing normally. We have military escorts providing assistance, and we expect to land in Anchorage in approximately 1 hour and 45 minutes. She paused, letting that information settle before continuing. "I want to assure you that this aircraft is designed to fly safely on one engine, and all of our systems are operating normally. The cabin crew will be providing you with information about emergency landing procedures, which are purely precautionary. I have been flying for over 20 years, including extensive experience with emergency procedures, and I am confident in our ability to land safely in Anchorage." What she didn't mention was that her extensive experience with emergency procedures included situations far more challenging than engine failures, like the time she had nursed an F-22 with multiple system failures back to base while being pursued by enemy aircraft, or the mission where she had landed a severely damaged fighter on a runway that was too short for a normal approach. In the F-35s flying alongside, Thompson and Park were monitoring multiple radio frequencies, coordinating with both civilian air traffic control and military command. The presence of Phoenix in the disabled airliner had elevated the priority of the mission to the highest levels. Every available resource was being marshaled to ensure the successful outcome of Flight 847's emergency landing. "Phoenix, this is Viper 1, Thompson radioed. We're coordinating with Anchorage Tower to ensure you have priority clearance and emergency services standing by. Is there anything else we can provide from our position?" Sarah considered the question while monitoring her engine parameters and fuel calculations. The escorts were providing valuable external observation and radio relay capabilities. But, more than that, they represented a connection to the military community where she had learned the skills that were now keeping 164 people alive. "Viper 1, Phoenix," she replied. "Continue external observation and relay any changes in the number 2 engine area. Also, if you could coordinate with Anchorage for runway conditions and wind reports, that would be helpful." As the disabled Boeing 777 continued its approach toward Alaska, escorted by 2 of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, Sarah Martinez was transforming back into the pilot who had become legendary for her ability to save lives against impossible odds. The commercial airline captain was merging with the combat pilot, creating something greater than either alone. The Phoenix was rising, and 164 lives hung in the balance. At 11:30 a.m. Pacific Time, Flight 847 was 45 minutes from landing at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport, and Sarah Martinez was about to face the most challenging approach of her career. The aircraft was stabilized at 8,000 feet, its single remaining engine providing just enough thrust to maintain level flight while carrying a fuel load that was still 15,000 pounds above ideal landing weight. Every calculation, every decision, every input to the flight controls would need to be perfect. "Anchorage Tower, Trans-Pacific 847 requesting vectors for approach to runway 7 left," Sarah transmitted, her voice carrying the same calm professionalism that had characterized every radio call during the 3-hour emergency. "Trans-Pacific 847, Anchorage Tower," came the immediate reply. "You are cleared direct to the outer marker for ILS approach runway 7 left. Emergency services are standing by. Winds are currently light and variable, visibility unlimited. You have priority clearance." Through the cockpit windows, the Alaska landscape was spectacular, snow-covered mountains stretching to the horizon, pristine wilderness broken only by the occasional road or settlement. But Sarah's attention was focused entirely on the instruments and the approach chart spread across her lap. The ILS approach to runway 7L was straightforward in normal conditions, but nothing about their current situation was normal. First Officer Chen was monitoring their single-engine performance parameters while coordinating with the cabin crew for the emergency landing preparation. The Boeing 777's sophisticated flight management computer was providing guidance, but Sarah had disconnected the autopilot 30 minutes ago. She needed to feel the aircraft through the controls, to sense every nuance of its behavior as they prepared for landing. Phoenix, Viper 1, Lieutenant Colonel Thompson's voice crackled through the radio from the F-35 flying alongside them. "We're showing intermittent vapor trails from your number 2 engine area. Appears to be residual fuel or hydraulic fluid burning off. No visible flame or active fire." Sarah acknowledged the report while making a mental note to expect possible emergency evacuation procedures after landing. Even a successful landing wouldn't end the emergency if there was any possibility of post-landing fire. But that was a problem for after they were safely on the ground. "Chen," she said to her first officer, "I want you to brief the cabin crew on rapid evacuation procedures. If we have any fire indications after landing, we'll need to get everyone off the aircraft quickly." The approach to Anchorage would require every bit of skill Sarah had developed over 20 years of flying. The aircraft was heavy, flying on one engine, and would need to touch down at a higher than normal speed to maintain control authority. The margin between a successful landing and disaster was measured in knots of airspeed and feet of runway distance. At 8,000 feet above the Alaska wilderness, Sarah began her final approach preparations. The aircraft's weight meant they would touch down at approximately 180 miles per hour instead of the normal 160. The asymmetric thrust from the single engine would require constant pressure on the rudder pedals to maintain directional control. Most challenging of all, they would have only one chance to get it right. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," Sarah announced over the intercom. "We are beginning our approach to Anchorage. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened and your seats are in the upright position. The cabin crew will be taking their emergency positions for landing." In the passenger cabin, 164 people were experiencing the final moments of what many would later describe as the longest flight of their lives. The church group from Dallas had maintained their prayer circle throughout the approach, their quiet voices providing a backdrop of calm in the otherwise tense cabin. The business travelers were gripping their armrests, watching out the windows as the Alaskan landscape grew larger below them. The honeymooning couple near the front had spent the entire approach holding hands, drawing strength from each other as they faced the unknown together. Jennifer Walsh and her cabin crew had reviewed emergency evacuation procedures until they could perform them in their sleep. Every exit was staffed, every piece of emergency equipment was positioned and ready. But, as she took her position for landing, Jennifer found herself thinking about Captain Martinez in the cockpit, calmly flying an approach that would challenge any pilot while maintaining the steady professionalism that had characterized her throughout the crisis. "Trans-Pacific 847, you are cleared for approach runway 7 left," came the controller's voice from Anchorage Tower. "Emergency services are in position. We have you on radar, maintaining glide path and centerline." Sarah keyed the microphone while maintaining her scan of the instruments. "Trans-Pacific 847 cleared for approach runway 7 left. We'll be landing at higher than normal speed due to single-engine configuration." The Boeing 777 descended through 6,000 feet as Sarah began the most delicate phase of the approach. The aircraft's single engine was providing thrust, but she needed to manage the power carefully. Too much thrust would make them fly too fast and long, potentially overrunning the runway. Too little thrust would cause them to lose airspeed and risk stalling before reaching the runway. "Gear down, landing checklist," Sarah called out, and Chen responded by lowering the landing gear and running through the pre-landing checklist. The additional drag from the extended landing gear required a slight increase in engine power, and Sarah could feel the aircraft's handling characteristics change as the gear locked into position. "Phoenix, Viper 1, Thompson radioed from the escorting F-35. You're looking good from our position. Gear appears down and locked, no visible external problems. We'll maintain escort until you're safely on the ground." At 3,000 feet above the ground, the runway at Anchorage was visible through the windscreen, a long concrete strip surrounded by emergency vehicles with flashing lights. Sarah could see the crash trucks positioned along the runway, ready to respond if anything went wrong during the landing. But she was focused entirely on the approach, every sense attuned to the aircraft's behavior as they continued their descent. "Speed looks good," Chen reported. "On glide path, on centerline." Sarah was flying the approach manually, her hands on the controls feeling every input required to keep the heavy aircraft tracking toward the runway. The asymmetric thrust was trying to pull them to the right, requiring constant pressure on the left rudder pedal. The reduced hydraulic pressure was making the controls heavier than normal, but still responsive enough for precise control. 2,000 feet, Chen called out. "Speed 185, on target." The runway was growing larger in the windscreen, and Sarah could see the precision approach path indicator lights showing green over white exactly where they needed to be for a safe landing. But the real challenge would come in the final moments before touchdown, when she would need to manage the aircraft's energy perfectly to achieve a safe landing on the long runway. 1,000 feet, Chen announced. "Speed 182, slightly fast." Sarah reduced the power slightly, feeling the aircraft respond to the thrust reduction. The Boeing 777 continued its descent toward the runway, now clearly visible ahead of them. Emergency vehicles were positioned every 1,000 feet along the runway, their flashing lights creating a corridor of safety for the approaching aircraft. 500 feet, Chen called. "Speed 180, on target." Sarah could see the runway threshold approaching rapidly. The aircraft was stable, tracking directly down the center line, with airspeed exactly where it needed to be for a safe touchdown. But she was already thinking about what would happen after they touched down, the need for maximum braking, the possibility of emergency evacuation, the coordination required to ensure all 164 people evacuated safely if necessary. 200 feet, Chen announced. "Looking good." The runway was rushing up to meet them, and Sarah was making final adjustments to the aircraft's attitude and airspeed. The single engine was still running smoothly, providing the thrust they needed to maintain control all the way to touchdown. The landing gear was ready to absorb the impact of a heavier than normal landing, and the brakes were prepared for maximum stopping performance. 100 feet, Chen called. 50 feet. Sarah pulled back slightly on the control yoke, raising the aircraft's nose for touchdown. The Boeing 777's main landing gear contacted the runway with a firm but controlled impact, exactly on the centerline and at the proper touchdown point. The aircraft was safely on the ground, but the emergency wasn't over yet. "Reverse thrust, maximum braking," Sarah commanded, pulling the thrust reverser lever while applying full brake pressure. The single remaining engine roared as its thrust was redirected forward, helping to slow the heavy aircraft. The anti-skid system prevented the wheels from locking up as Sarah applied maximum brake pressure. The Boeing 777 rolled down the long runway, its speed bleeding off rapidly under the combined effects of reverse thrust, wheel brakes, and aerodynamic drag. Sarah maintained directional control with the rudder pedals, keeping the aircraft tracking down the centerline as it decelerated. "Speed 100 knots, Chen called out. 80 knots. 60 knots. At 12:17 p.m. Pacific Time, Trans-Pacific Airways Flight 847 came to a complete stop on runway 7L at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport. 164 people were safely on the ground in Alaska, saved by the skill and experience of a pilot who had once been shot down over enemy territory and had turned that experience into the foundation for one of the most remarkable emergency landings in aviation history. But, as Sarah Martinez sat in the captain's seat of the now motionless Boeing 777, she knew the emergency wasn't quite over yet. They still needed to evacuate the aircraft safely and ensure that the smoldering No. 2 engine didn't reignite. The Phoenix had landed safely, but her work wasn't finished. As Flight 847 sat motionless on the runway at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport, Sarah Martinez was already shifting from landing mode to post-emergency procedures. The aircraft was safely on the ground, but, with 164 people aboard and a potentially unstable engine situation, her responsibilities as captain were far from over. Emergency vehicles surrounded the Boeing 777, their red and white lights painting the Alaska afternoon in urgent colors. "Anchorage ground, Trans-Pacific 847 is safely on the ground and stopped," Sarah radioed to the tower. Request emergency services inspection of number 2 engine area before passenger disembarkation. Trans-Pacific 847, Anchorage ground, came the immediate reply. Emergency services are approaching your aircraft now. Maintain position and await clearance for passenger evacuation. Through the cockpit windows, Sarah could see firefighters in silver protective suits approaching the aircraft with thermal imaging equipment, searching for any signs of heat or active fire in the damaged engine area. The careful choreography of emergency response was unfolding exactly as it had been practiced countless times in training scenarios. First Officer Chen was completing the post-landing checklist while monitoring the emergency radio frequencies. All systems showing normal except for number 2 engine, which is completely shut down, he reported. Hydraulic system 2 is offline, but systems 1 and 3 are functioning normally. Sarah acknowledged the report while maintaining her watch on the emergency crews outside. She had performed emergency landings before during her military career, but never with the responsibility for so many civilian lives. The weight of command felt different when the people depending on you included families, children, elderly passengers who had placed their complete trust in her abilities. "Phoenix, this is Viper 1, came the familiar voice of Lieutenant Colonel Thompson from the F-35 that had escorted them throughout the emergency. "Outstanding job getting that bird on the ground safely. Emergency services are giving thumbs up, no active fire, minimal residual heat signature." The relief in Sarah's voice was audible when she replied. "Thanks for the escort, Viper 1. Couldn't have asked for better company during the approach." In the passenger cabin, the mood was a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and growing awareness of just how serious their situation had been. The business travelers were beginning to use their phones to contact family and colleagues. The church group from Dallas was offering prayers of thanksgiving. The honeymooning couple was holding each other tightly, realizing that their new marriage had already survived its first major crisis together. Jennifer Walsh and her cabin crew were preparing for what they hoped would be a normal passenger disembarkation rather than an emergency evacuation. The careful preparations they had made for rapid evacuation, positioning emergency equipment, briefing passengers on procedures, preparing for the worst-case scenario had proven unnecessary, but their readiness had provided crucial peace of mind during the emergency. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," Sarah announced over the intercom. "We have landed safely in Anchorage, and emergency services have confirmed that there are no active fire or safety concerns with our aircraft. We will be disembarking normally through the forward and aft doors. Please remain seated until we have pulled up to the gate." But, as the Boeing 777 was slowly towed to a gate position under the guidance of emergency vehicles, Sarah was already thinking beyond the immediate crisis. The investigation that would follow would examine every aspect of the engine failure, the crew's response, and the emergency procedures that had been followed. As captain, she would be responsible for detailed reports, interviews with safety investigators, and coordination with the airline's emergency response teams. 20 minutes later, as passengers began filing off the aircraft onto the jet bridge at Anchorage, many stopped to thank Sarah personally. The business executive from Microsoft shook her hand and said he had never experienced such professional crisis management. The elderly woman from the church group patted her arm and told her she had been praying for her throughout the flight. The honeymooning couple asked to take a photo with the captain who had saved their first day as a married couple. But it was 8-year-old Tommy Chen, no relation to her first officer, traveling with his grandmother to visit family in Tokyo, who provided the moment that would stay with Sarah forever. As he walked past the cockpit door, he stopped and looked up at her with wide, serious eyes. "Are you really a superhero?" he asked with the directness that only children can manage. Sarah knelt down to his eye level and smiled. "No, Tommy. I'm just a pilot who had some really good training and some really good help today." Tommy considered this seriously for a moment, then nodded. "Well, you saved my grandma, so I think you're a hero anyway." As the last passengers disembarked, Sarah remained in the cockpit completing the post-flight documentation that would become part of the official record of Flight 847's emergency. The aircraft would be thoroughly inspected, the failed engine would be removed and analyzed, and the entire sequence of events would be studied to improve emergency procedures and training. Outside the aircraft, Lieutenant Colonel Thompson and Captain Park were waiting to meet the legendary pilot they had escorted to safety. When Sarah finally emerged from the jet bridge, Thompson approached with the kind of respect reserved for fellow warriors who had proven themselves under fire.
"Captain Martinez," Thompson said, extending his hand. "Lieutenant Colonel Jake Thompson, call sign Viper.
I wanted to personally congratulate you on one of the finest pieces of airmanship I've ever witnessed." Sarah shook his hand, feeling the connection that existed between military aviators who understood the complexities of flying under pressure.
"Thank you for the escort, Colonel. Made all the difference having you out there."
"Ma'am," Captain Park stepped forward, her young face reflecting admiration mixed with curiosity. "I'm Captain Lisa Park, call sign Razor.
I have to ask, are you really the Phoenix who pulled off the Kandahar rescue mission?"
Sarah smiled at the question that took her back to another life, another time when flying had been about combat missions rather than passenger safety. "That was a long time ago, Captain."
"Different aircraft, different mission."
"But the same pilot," Thompson observed. "Today proves that some skills transfer across any aircraft, any mission." As they stood in the Anchorage terminal, surrounded by the controlled chaos of an aviation emergency response, Sarah reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this moment. She had left military flying seeking peace, routine, and the satisfaction of safely transporting passengers rather than engaging enemy aircraft. But, when crisis had struck at 30,000 feet over the Pacific, it was her combat training and military discipline that had saved 164 lives. The next several hours would be filled with debriefings, interviews, and coordination with Trans-Pacific Airways Crisis Response Team.
Passengers would be rerouted on other flights to complete their journeys to Tokyo.
The media would want to interview the captain who had saved Flight 847, and aviation safety experts would analyze every aspect of the emergency response. But, standing in the Alaska terminal as emergency responders completed their work, Sarah Martinez understood that she had found something she hadn't known she was looking for. The integration of her military experience with her civilian career hadn't been an ending, it had been preparation for this moment when all of her skills, all of her training, and all of her experience had come together to save lives.
3 weeks later, at a ceremony at Trans-Pacific Airways headquarters, Sarah would receive the airline's highest honor for exceptional service. The Federal Aviation Administration would recognize her emergency handling as a textbook example of crisis management.
Aviation Week magazine would feature her story as their cover article, titled "When Phoenix Flies Again." But, the recognition that would matter most to her came in the form of cards and letters from the 164 passengers whose lives she had saved. Tommy Chen's grandmother sent a photo of him wearing a pilot's cap with a note saying he had decided he wanted to be a pilot when he grew up, just like Captain Martinez. The honeymooning couple sent an invitation to their first anniversary party, crediting their marriage's strong start to the experience of facing crisis together under the care of a skilled pilot. The church group from Dallas had added her to their prayer list, not for protection, but in thanksgiving for the skills and calm professionalism she had demonstrated in their moment of greatest need. The business travelers had written to Trans-Pacific Airways CEO, demanding that Captain Martinez be recognized for extraordinary service and requesting to fly with her whenever possible. As Sarah returned to flying the Pacific routes she loved, now with even greater appreciation for the responsibility she carried with each flight, she realized that the Phoenix hadn't risen from the ashes of her military career. The Phoenix had simply been waiting for the moment when all of her experience, all of her training, and all of her love of flying would be needed to save lives. On a clear Thursday morning 6 months later, as Captain Sarah Martinez pushed back from the gate at Los Angeles International Airport for another routine flight to Tokyo, she noticed two familiar shapes in the sky above F-35 Lightning II fighters conducting training flights. She smiled and keyed her radio to the military frequency she remembered so well.
"Good morning, Viper Flight. This is Phoenix. Blue skies and tailwinds."
The response came immediately, filled with the warmth reserved for fellow aviators who had shared the sky during moments of crisis and triumph.
"Good morning, Phoenix. It's an honor to share the sky with you again."
As Trans-Pacific Airways Flight 419 climbed toward its cruising altitude above the Pacific, Sarah Martinez settled into her captain's seat with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found her true calling not in the choice between military and civilian flying, but in the integration of both. The Phoenix had taught her that heroes don't retire, they just find new ways to serve, new lives to protect, new moments to prove that the sky belongs to those with the skill and courage to master it. At 30,000 feet above the endless blue Pacific, Captain Sarah Phoenix Martinez was exactly where she belonged, protecting the lives entrusted to her care and carrying forward the legacy of excellence that had made her legendary in both military and civilian aviation. The Phoenix had risen not just once, but as many times as the sky demanded her service. And the sky, it seemed, would always need heroes.